weeks ago, you know, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away when we actually met previously, we did Isaiah chapter 38 and 39 because they are in chronological order if they come first. So if you're looking at this and go, well, did we do 38 and 39? I explained that when we were together last, is that they actually chronologically come first before chapters 36 and 37. So we're diving into 36 and 37, and then we hit the ground running with Isaiah chapter 40. And I mean that literally, hit the ground running because we walk and not weary, and we run, and we're going to soar. Okay, we're going to do all that when we get to Isaiah chapter 40. Right now, let me set this up, and we're going to kind of circle around. So if you're going to, when are we ever going to get to Isaiah chapter 36 and 37? So there's a method to my madness, so hang with me on this one. And so here we go. We're going to rock and roll with Isaiah chapter 36, 37, with the 9th letter in the series, which I'm calling Mail Fraud. When we last left King Isaiah in his palace in 701 BC, he had just dodged what we called a health scare bullet, which was in chapter 38. And now he's mentally processing a rather dreary proclamation by the prophet Isaiah about the complete future ransacking of the king's beloved temple treasures by the ruthless Babylonians, unknown at the time. There's this uprising that is occurring. You and I look back on it Monday morning quarterbacking and go, oh yeah, the Babylonians, they were huge, they were a horrific empire, and they were ruthless. They don't know that in 701 BC. They have no idea these people are, there's some rumblings over there in Mesopotamia, but the Babylonians are actually coming to power. And here's Isaiah spouting off, yeah, they're going to be a big deal one day, and they're going to just annihilate you and ransack and everything else. And there's going to be a wholesale exile of the southern kingdom of Judah, completely, lock, stock, and gun barrel, including some of Hezekiah's very own offspring. In 701 BC, he has no offspring. So this is quite prophetic that Isaiah has actually dropped this in his lap, and of course, he has to process this. And he wonders why this was all put on him, and it is really because the self-confident king did something that we talked about last time we were together as well. He gave this well-wishing, glad-handing Babylonian envoy that had come to wish him well and send him a get-well card. He gave them a no-holds-barred grand tour of Judah. Both palace and entire kingdom were on display, including a walk through the vaults and through the armory of Jerusalem, down in the bowels of the city, right? Down in all the subterranean stuff. So now these strangers, these foreigners, are eye level with the stockpiles of weapons, which they can see, the storehouses of goods, and the treasure troves of the spoils of war, which are profound. And of course, that was just a little too much revealing to the enemy camp. And Isaiah says as much. Well, the king just shrugs off Isaiah's far-flung doom and gloom speech. He thinks it's too futuristic. It's not even relevant in his own lifetime. He has bigger fish to fry because he has a very real enemy staring him down like a gun barrel. It's King Sennacherib and the Assyrians, who are, in fact, the evil empire at the time. So he has no time for this fly that we're swatting called Babylon. He doesn't even really want to consider that. The Assyrians had just surrounded the fortified city of Lachish, which is a garrison. It's about 30 miles to the southwest of Jerusalem, not far as the crow flies. And it actually served as a garrison to guard the main road that led to Jerusalem. So this is very strategic for an enemy. If you want to take out Jerusalem, you got to take out the other cities that are guarding Jerusalem. So you have to take out Lachish. Just like the children of Israel in 1400 BC, if you wanted to inherit and inhabit the promised land, you've got to take out the garrisons. And you all know the famous garrison where the walls fell down. You take out Jericho, and you take out Ai, and then you've got yourself a kind of you basically torn out the welcome mat, so now you can actually enter into the land. Same is true here with this military strategy, taking out Lachish. Now it's guarding this road leading to Jerusalem. News gets to the palace that that's actually happening, that the Assyrian pincers, like a crab, are now closing in on the holy city of peace. To date, the evil empire, according to the morning report handed to the king in 701 BC, to date, the evil empire of Assyria had conquered 46 fortified towns and as many villages, and the current tally of Judean citizens that were now in captivity had reached 200,146 in 701 BC. City after city had fallen to Sennacherib, and long lines of deportees were already snaking their bitter way into exile. It was on the news every single night. Refugees lined up for as far as the eye could see, sneaking their way back to Assyrian captivity, likely the city of Nineveh. But the palace intrigue, if you want to call it that, going in and around the southern kingdom of Judah and the capital city of Jerusalem, was not so much concerned by this alarming head count of the incarcerated of their very own citizens, but rather with the number 3. Let me read to you from 2 Kings chapter 18. The king of Assyria sent his commander-in-chief, his field commander, and his chief of staff from Lachish with a huge army to confront King Hezekiah in Jerusalem. The Assyrians took up a position beside the aqueduct that feeds water into the upper pool near the road leading to the field where cloth is washed. Now, we have to picture this correctly. This is no sideline meeting of some ineffectual subcommittees. That's not what this is. These were 3 of the evil empire's best diplomatic, political, and military strategists in both negotiations and psychological warfare that were sent to Jerusalem to actually secure Hezekiah's surrender of the capital city of Jerusalem, and nothing less. Their titles were, as the Bible describes them in 2 Kings chapter 18, really, technically, is Tartan is the first one. That's the commander-in-chief. Rabsaris is the second one. That's the field commander. And last but not least, their spokesman is a guy that they are describing. I love the way this sounds phonetically. Rabshakeh. Okay, come on. Wouldn't that be a great villain? Rabshakeh. I know the Avengers are over, but really a new villain. Rabshakeh. Chief of staff. It's the Assyrian chief of staff. Now they're going up against 3 of Judah's leading officers. They're not going to bring out just their little, their sideline people. They're bringing out their big guns as well. Joah, the royal historian, Shebna, the court secretary, and Eliakim, who is the palace administrator. These 3 on both sides actually now are coming together at this point. Now it's interesting that only Joah, who was the royal historian, goes down in his royal history with an unsullied reputation. The last 2 of these supposed prime ministers, they turn out to be only hollow public servants. Here's how this goes down a little later. Shebna, the court secretary, turns out he was only concerned about himself and his own glory. Now there's a shock for a politician. Having achieved the highest position in the land, just under the king, much like what Joseph achieved back in Egypt, okay? He used this position to build a memorial for himself. And back in that day, the memorial for yourself really was a nice, gaudy tomb. Ever seen the pyramids? That's what the pharaohs were all into. A nice, gaudy tomb. And so he has this presumptuous royal tomb dug out, all ready for his last day on earth. And oh, so sad, as luck would have it, he's demoted. So it's likely prevented he ever occupied this tomb that he built for himself because he'd abused his office. And so he's summarily replaced by Eliakim, the 3rd person in this little diplomatic envoy. But even with the best of intentions, this newly appointed court secretary Eliakim, his confidence eventually failed him. He could not sustain the weight of his family burdens and his many other responsibilities that were foisted upon his shoulders, and finally the whole thing came crashing down upon him. Here's the point. These testimonies once again fortify the notion that professional politicians cannot be trusted nor relied upon to solve problems that only God can solve. I'm glad you're all sitting down for that. That is so obvious, was it not? A lesson that King Hezekiah is about to learn, and learn very dramatically. The meeting of the 6 represents, really as this story plays out, a final confrontation between Assyria and Judah. And it's taking place on a very significant spot. For those of you with really good memories, we did talk about this 30 years earlier. This is from Isaiah chapter 7, verse 3. Hezekiah's father, King Ahaz, who was an idiot, was caught by the prophet Isaiah, smugly gawking up at Jerusalem's impressive above-ground aqueduct that channeled water into an upper pool on the north side of Jerusalem. Now stay with me here. That is actually in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 3, 26 years later, 705 BC, during the time of Assyrian political preoccupation with their royal changing of the guard in Nineveh, when Sennacherib succeeded the previous king Sargon. In other words, as a military strategist, and the Bible spouts this off all over the place, is these guys, if you're going to rebel against an evil empire, get them preoccupied. If you're going to annihilate somebody, get them preoccupied. Let them turn over here as a decoy, and then you attack them from the rear or whatever side you want to attack them on. Assyria was no exception, even though it was large and in power at the time. If they had a political election, they were preoccupied with the election, the televising of the inaugurations and all that. It's like that was big stuff back in Assyria's day. So you always took advantage of the fact that they were kind of thinking about themselves because they had a changing of the guard. In this case, King Sargon's son, Sennacherib, now takes over the throne. And King Hezekiah thinks this is a perfect time when they're not so focused on conquering everybody and stomping them all out. This is a perfect time for ourselves, Judah, and any others who want to join in to stand our ground and refuse to pay any tribute, taxes, to the evil empire. And stand his ground he did. But after just 3 years, Isaiah shows up again, warning against Hezekiah's change of heart. Because now, suddenly, after 3 years of this strong stance of not paying any taxes, he now decides to buy off the Assyrians by not just paying just money, that would be just not really showing that we're committed, but he actually rips off all the temple treasures, robs the church, as it were, including stripping off the gold overlay from its doors and doorposts. Just to show, this was a sacrilegious tribute payment in the hopes that the Assyrian army would honor their so-called alliance with Judah and withdraw this intimidating, rebellion, squelching, advancing troop mentality that Assyria pounded day after day. And this was an alliance Hezekiah's own father tried to forge with the previous king from Assyria, who was named Tiglath-Pileser III, which we just affectionately called Tig, because Ahaz wanted so badly to be his best friend. So he was best friends with Tig. But Assyria's current king Sennacherib had, in fact, broken every single agreement, and he invaded Judah anyway. He could give a flying flip about temple treasures that were given by Hezekiah, which should come as no surprise. Sennacherib goes down in history as a thief, a traitor, and a tyrant. All of that had started when Ahaz was under the same aqueduct, and Isaiah approached him with the smoking Christmas card that he gave him when he was trying to jump into bed with the king of Assyria, his new buddy Tig. And now 3 decades later, here they are again, back in the exact same spot, under the aqueduct, supposedly negotiating. But Hezekiah was not about to just stand there like his father. For Hezekiah, the exposed and elevated aqueduct represented a colossal weakness in what was otherwise a pretty invincible city of Jerusalem, perched as it was on a hill. And the king knew that they would all be hung out to dry, like so many clotheslines along the adjacent field that he could see from this aqueduct, if they didn't do something. And Hezekiah knew that their only hope was to go underground. The king set in motion a technological marvel of his day. He officiated over the digging of an underground tunnel, cutting through the hill of Ophel that would carry water from the upper gushing Gihon spring located at the base of the eastern slope of the city. So he moved from the northern location, which they now stood, abandoned that, moved everything over to the east, and started digging this tunnel from Gihon spring all the way down to the pool of Siloam, thereby giving the city a protected water supply. Absolutely crucial. So if anyone, whatever, be it Assyria or Babylon or Franktown, if anyone tried to pull a siege off and surround Jerusalem, they would have this protected water supply, and they could withstand and survive, hopefully, a siege from any enemy or invading army. This subterranean tunnel, which exists to this day, twisted and turned to avoid difficulties in the rock and followed fissures. And by doing so, it added an extra 700 feet to what the crow's flying distance would have actually been. The completed tunnel was 1,777 feet long. And these gangs of workmen started at opposite ends. And remember now, they're chipping away at rock and rubble with the clock ticking. Assyria is pounding at the door. They are only 10 miles away now. And you're digging this tunnel because you know that this thing is actually going down. Using only sound, they amazingly met in the middle. Hello? 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 I can't imagine. They met in the middle. This fantastic feat, however, when it was done, and it truly would protect the water supply, it is viewed from heaven as an unforgivable sin. Go figure. Look at Isaiah chapter 22. Isaiah chapter 22, and as I said before, we will get to our text today. This is just very interesting. Isaiah 22, verse 9. I'm in the New Living Translation once again. We're teaching this whole series from the New Living Translation. Isaiah chapter 22, verse 9. This is God talking through Isaiah. You inspect the breaks in the walls of Jerusalem. You store up water in the lower pool. You survey the houses and tear some down for stone to strengthen the walls. Between the city walls, you build a reservoir for water from the old pool. But you never ask for help from the one who did all this. You never considered the one who planned this long ago. Look at verse 14. The Lord of heaven's armies has revealed this to me. Till the day you die, you will never be forgiven for this sin. That is the judgment of the Lord of heaven's armies. In other words, Jerusalem was a city with a strategic location that the Lord had specifically chosen for his people and for himself. He knew all about its water supply when he chose it. And he knowingly chose a city with a vulnerable water supply so that living in his city actually required an attitude and commitment of faith that what he chose he would also safeguard and protect. It is no coincidence that Abraham tried to sacrifice his son on the same Mount Moriah. What you're going to safeguard and protect. And this commitment of faith did not exist because now they were actually pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps. It is not wrong to improve our amenities or to allow human ingenuity to devise better accomplishments of engineering. The sin here is replacing simple trusting faith with man-made devices and securities. Maybe even a cell phone or an iPad. The tunnel forsook the way of faith for a way of works. Acting as if the most important things the Jews could do were the human things that they could do for themselves. That was their priority. And in spite of all this, Isaiah's bulk mill rant against Jerusalem, which he gave 10 years before, as predicted, along with his astounding subterranean tunnel, Hezekiah went about fortifying the rest of the city. Because, as Gandalf said in Lord of the Rings, they're coming. Look at 2 Chronicles. Turn back to 2 Chronicles chapter 32. A couple books over, 2 Chronicles chapter 32, verse 2. 32, verse 2. When Hezekiah realized that Sennacherib also intended to attack Jerusalem, he consulted with his officials and military advisors, and they decided to stop the flow of the springs outside the city. They organized a huge work crew to stop the flow of the springs, cutting off the brook that ran through the fields. For they said, why should the kings of Assyria come here and find plenty of water? Then Hezekiah worked hard at repairing all of the broken sections of the wall, erecting towers, and constructing a second wall outside the first. He also reinforced the supporting terraces in the city of David and manufactured large numbers of weapons and shields. He appointed military officers over the people and assembled them before him in the square at the city gate. And then Hezekiah encouraged the people by saying a line that he borrowed from 700 years previously, be strong and courageous. So says Joshua, and now says Hezekiah. Don't be afraid or discouraged because of the king of Assyria or his mighty army, for there is a power far greater on our side. He may have a great army, but they are merely men. We have the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles for us. Hezekiah's words greatly encouraged the people, but God still condemned Hezekiah's presumed self-sufficiency, like this omnicompetence we talked about that the Moabites were guilty of. Hezekiah's fortifications and his tunnel were in fact going to go down in history. He's noted for these great achievements, 2 Kings 20:20. But to God, it was all a flimsy showcase of a previous worldly reliance on Assyria, Syria, and Egypt that had now turned into a self-reliance on walls, weapons, and a water supply. A desperate government construction project that included eminent domain that even robbed certain citizens of Jerusalem of their very own houses. God was not impressed. So he wields what he calls his rod of anger, his club for the day, and the name of the club is Sennacherib. Isaiah chapter 10. Back to Isaiah chapter 10, verse 5. Isaiah 10, verse 5. What sorrow awaits Assyria, the rod of my anger? I use it as a club to express my anger. I am sending Assyria against a godless nation, against a people with whom I am angry. Assyria will plunder them, trampling them like dirt beneath its feet. But the king of Assyria will not understand that he is my tool. His mind does not work that way. His plan is simply to destroy, to cut down nation after nation. Look at verse 12. After the Lord had used the king of Assyria to accomplish his purposes on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, he will turn against the king of Assyria and punish him, for he is proud and arrogant. He boasts, by my own powerful arm I have done this. With my own shrewd wisdom I have planned this. I have broken down the defenses of nations and carried off their treasures. I have knocked down their kings like a bull. I have robbed their nests of riches and gathered up kingdoms as a farmer gathers eggs. No one can even flap a wing against me or utter a peep of protest. That was so interesting. In 1830, a clay prism that was found in the ruins of Nineveh, which exists to this day, it's dating back to 689 BC. It quotes King Sennacherib, who is, of course, bragging, which all they did was on the steles and everything else that they have uncovered. These giant empires were always bragging about their exploits. This is no exception. He says this, Hezekiah himself, like a caged bird, I shut up in Jerusalem, his royal city. In other words, I trapped the caged bird. So both the Bible and the king of Assyria have a thing about birds in cages. Jeremiah 5:27, Psalm 124, verse 7. But the king of Assyria is about to get his just deserts from who we will call the great ornithologist. And here's the threat. The huge Assyrian army, in the meantime, with all of this going on, has taken up position under the shadow of the aqueduct, and the chief of staff, here he is again, the Rabshakeh, lets loose. So now turn to Isaiah chapter 36. We have now landed where we're supposed to. Isaiah chapter 36, verse 4. 36, verse 4. Then the Assyrian king's chief of staff, the Rabshakeh, told them to give this message to Hezekiah. Now, I want you to do something while you're listening to these words, because it's going to look, oh, this is just a historical thing. It's got a lot of intrigue, and it's got suspense, and it's got a tit for tat, and it's diplomatic. And don't do that. Look at these verses and picture yourself surrounded in this city. And think about all of the present day doubt and deceptions and mind games that are played upon all of us by the evil one that go on in your head as you read this. Listen to these words from a very evil ambassador, the Rabshakeh. This is what the great king of Assyria says. Why are you trusting, what are you trusting in that makes you so confident? Do you think that mere words can substitute for military skill and strength. Who are you counting on? That you have rebelled against me? On Egypt? If you lean on Egypt, it will be like a reed that splinters beneath your weight and pierces your hand. Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, is completely unreliable. Oh, but perhaps you will say to me, we are trusting in the Lord our God. Yeah, but isn't he the one who was insulted by Hezekiah? Didn't Hezekiah tear down his shrines and altars and make everyone in Judah and Jerusalem worship only at the altar here in Jerusalem? I'll tell you what. Strike a bargain with my master, the king of Assyria, and I'll give you 2,000 horses, if you can find that many men to ride on them. With your tiny army, how can you think of challenging even the weakest contingent of my master's troops, even with the help of Egypt's chariots and charioteers? What's more, do you think we have invaded your land without the Lord's direction? The Lord himself told us, attack this land and destroy it. For those living in unbelief, the Assyrian's chief of staff's arguments must have seemed reasonable. He knew how to play on the nerve ends of any who were less than convinced, to scare the citizens of Jerusalem and to alienate them from their leadership. Nothing's changed, folks, when it comes to evil strategies, which made the cunningly offered peaceful relocation plan that the Assyrians promised by the Assyrians, it made that all the more enticing. Isaiah 36, 16 to 17. And it is the same as with us. When caught unaware, the enemy's lies, accusations, and insinuations penetrate proportionately as deep as we have allowed our hesitations, doubt, and unbelief to fester and grow. We are fertile ground if we allow that to happen. Ignoring Judah's prime minister's entreaty, which was this. Oh my gosh, don't speak in the street language. I don't want these people to hear this. They're going to buckle if you say anything to them. So let's just talk among ourselves in our own language. And he said, oh, no. He starts yelling in Hebrew for everyone to hear, especially those little listening birds that are all perched on the wall of the city. Look at verse 14, chapter 36. This is what the king says. Do you hear that echo? This is what the king says. Now we're not having a parlay with the other diplomats. He's looking straight up at those people. This is what the king says. Don't let Hezekiah deceive you. He will never be able to rescue you. Don't let him fool you into trusting in the Lord by saying, the Lord will surely rescue us. The city will never fall into the hands of the Assyrian king. He even went so far as to give a list of all of the Assyria's military conquests to scare them to death, because the conquests were true. Cities both known and unknown to us in this day in 2019, one fall after another, including the demise of Judah's northern neighbor, the northern kingdom of Israel, which fell in 722 BC. That was 21 years earlier. Look at verse 19, the very end of verse 19. Did any God rescue Samaria from my power? Think of that. Here's this guy screaming in Hebrew. And here's these diplomats from Judah going, no, la, 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 la. Oh my gosh, what are these people going to do? No one's going to rally behind us. No one's going to survive 5 minutes in a siege if they shut us down. What is going to happen? Well, he actually brings up his trump card. Your northern neighbor, your sister, we've already obliterated. And that would be in very recent memory, because that is their neighbor to the north, and it was Assyria that did, in fact, knock them dead and take them all. Which brings us, of course, to our roving, ongoing little game that we're playing for the sake of retention. It's been a while, so you need to do this again so that we get the cobwebs dusted off, all right? We are doing God's rock, paper, scissors to actually, I would say, hammer home these exploits that have occurred during the life and times and career of the prophet Isaiah. And the first one is line number 1. So, there you have your hand out, other hand's a fist. Assyria crushes northern Israel. Happened 21 years ago, according to this text where we're at right now, but we need to have it memorized. Try it again, and say it out loud. Assyria crushes northern Israel. Here we go. At the risk of being repetitive, oh, so what? Here we go. Assyria crushes northern Israel. But the chief of staff, in all of this bombastic brouhaha about all the stuff that they've done and all the places they've conquered, he makes a fatal error. And you can see it in one letter. I want you to look at this in verse 19. And what about the gods of Sepharvaim? And did any god rescue Samaria from my power? Verse 20. What god of any nation has ever been able to save its people from my power? So what makes you think that the Lord can rescue Jerusalem from me? When you look at the word God in there, it's big G or little g? Small g. There is the cardinal sin, a blasphemy which the Lord himself actually heard. They had the audacity to equate the Lord with other gods. Small g. He heard it, and he remembered it. By King Hezekiah's explicit orders, so he knew maybe what this kind of wordplay was going to happen in the crazy way they were going to try to manipulate him and his people. He had explicit orders. Nobody talk to this chief of staff or his cohorts. Nobody respond to his speech, and so they didn't. I'm sure that was rough. Sweat going down the back. Don't talk to him. As they say, insolence is best answered by silence. But the word messenger is actually underlings, but even more accurately, flunkies. Which reads that Isaiah is really saying the king of Assyria's little lads, like he's patting them on the head, which is so like him. You know, he's almost done with his career. You know, the older you get, you just say what you mean. Right? And that's kind of where we're at with Isaiah. He must have delighted to cut down this Rabshakeh and the king of Assyria's other officials. It must be great to cut them down to size. I'm sure he relished that moment. But God also had Isaiah's ear, and he knew that those pompous Assyrians, no matter how much they talked a big game out front, they would not so much as shoot an arrow at Jerusalem. Met by the city's imposed silence, the 3 Assyrian officers, they returned to headquarters. Now, when the Rabshakeh and his other 2 cohorts first traveled to Jerusalem, Sennacherib and the Assyrian army, if you have been paying attention, were mopping up the city of Lachish. That's only 30 miles southwest from Jerusalem with their typical suffocation by siege. That's what they were known for. When they returned, everything had changed. The Assyrians had already conquered Lachish, and they were gone. In fact, excavations of Lachish, which still exist from the 1930s, excavations in the 70s, and more excavations in the 1980s have uncovered the skeletal remains of some 1,500 casualties of that war. The army now is gone. They now circled on to Libnah, which is just 10 miles north of Jerusalem, and it's the next city in this circle that just keeps getting smaller and smaller until its center point is the capital city. So they're gone. So now they arrive at this new theater of war, which is Libnah, and the Assyrian officers learn not only that the Assyrians have moved on to Libnah because Lachish is burning in flames, they realize, oh, we just heard word too that, by the way, Egypt is actually trying to come up north and help Jerusalem. Egypt. The Assyrian officers learned that splinter in your hand, that's what they called him, Egypt was in fact on its way to Hezekiah. Now, they did not want to fight a war on 2 fronts. Okay, one flank and then the other flank. They didn't want to do that, but they would if they had to. But the actual strategy then at that point was, okay, we got the Egyptian army, even though they're milquetoast, but they're coming. So they're coming up from the north. We're trying to circle in on Jerusalem. We've got to get that captured so we can knock down this whole nation of Judah. What are we going to do? I'll tell you what we need to do. As opposed to doing this with 2 fronts, let's ratchet up the pressure on Jerusalem. And that was what they said. Not to do this, let's go ahead and try to take these representatives, which would be the Rabshakeh, speaking for Sennacherib, stoke the fires of Judah unease, make them even more terrified and more nervous and more fearful, and put even more pressure on Jerusalem to surrender now. And we're going to do that in the form of a letter, a love note. This threat came in the form of what we would call in our day political hate mail. It's a fraudulent letter that included an even expanded list of the king's successful military exploits, because he loved to talk about himself and how threatening he really was. And it begins like this. This message is for King Hezekiah of Judah. Don't let your God in whom you trust deceive you. Wow. Deceive you with promises that Jerusalem will not be captured by the king of Assyria. Isaiah 37:10. Upon receiving and reading this letter in its entirety, the now helpless Hezekiah went up to the temple, dropped to his knees, and spread that letter out before the Lord right on the floor. His marvelous tunnel, his reinforced walls, and his highly trained warriors no longer mattered at all. The king saw what was really going on here, and he prayed accordingly, fulfilling Isaiah's decade-old prediction of Jerusalem brought to the ground, squealing for help. Here's what he said 10 years earlier. Then deep from the earth you will speak. From low in the dust your words will come. Your voice will whisper from the ground like a ghost conjured up from the grave. Isaiah 29:4. The way of believing prayer is the truly practical way of dealing with the harsh realities of life in this world. And nothing has changed. And so Hezekiah deals, and he deals on his knees. Look at 37 verse 16. O Lord, the God of heaven's armies, God of Israel, you are enthroned between the mighty cherubim. You alone are God of all the kingdoms of the earth. You alone created the heavens and the earth. Bend down, O Lord, and listen. Open your eyes, O Lord, and see. Listen to Sennacherib's words of defiance against the living God. It is true, Lord, that the kings of Assyria have destroyed all these nations. And they have thrown the gods of these nations into the fire and burned them. But of course the Assyrians could destroy them because they were not gods at all. They're only idols of wood and stone shaped by human hands. Now, O Lord our God, rescue us from his power. And power he had. Then all the kings of the earth will know that you alone, O Lord, are God. As a result of him dropping to his knees in the temple, so accurately depicted here, spreading this letter out before the Lord and praying this prayer that I just read to you, Hezekiah, Jerusalem, and all Judah for that matter were totally and instantly delivered. And the threat was utterly dismissed. Look at verse 36, Isaiah chapter 37. That night, what night? That night after this, the angel of the Lord went out to the Assyrian camp and killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. I love this part. When the surviving Assyrians, we don't know how many, but when they woke up the next morning, they found corpses everywhere. What a great movie scene. Come out of your tent, whoa, whoa. All my friends are dead. This army is like completely annihilated. Assyria's chief of staff had boasted of giving weakling Judah a gift of 2,000 horses. Because, why? Because that's the latest in military technology in 701 BC. Man, you had horses, man, you could rule the world. And this was really mocking the Jews for being out of touch with the latest developments, which I so appreciate and rapport with because I don't have a cell phone. So I get that. But it only took one of God's angels to destroy 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. Piece of cake. A fact that is brilliantly penned by 27-year-old English poet Lord Byron in his famous poem written 2,500 years after the fact. And an historical fact it was, folks. This is from 1850, and it's called The Destruction of Sennacherib. You may recognize some of these lines. People, they spout them off all the time. The Assyrian came down like the wolf on the fold, and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold. And the sheen of their spears was like stars on the sea when the blue waves roll nightly on deep Galilee. Like the leaves of the forest when summer is green, that host with their banners at sunset were seen. Like the leaves of the forest when autumn hath blown, that host on the morrow lay withered and strown. For the angel of death spread his wings on the blast, and breathed in the face of the foe as he passed. And the eyes of the sleepers waxed deadly and chill, and their hearts but once heaved, and forever grew still. And there lay the steed with his nostril all wide, but through it there rolled not the breath of his pride, and the foam of his gaping lay white on the turf, as cold as the spray on the rock-beating surf. And there lay the rider, distorted and pale, with the dew on his brow and the rust on his mail, and the tents were all silent, the banners alone, the lances unlifted, the trumpet unblown. And the widows of Asher are loud in their wail, and the idols are broke in the temple of Baal, and the might of the Gentile, unsmote by the sword, hath melted like snow in the glance of the Lord. Just as Isaiah had prophesied, God would mow down the Assyrians like a forest, devastate them with a storm, and throw them into the fire like garbage on a city dump. And he knew that he was going to do this all along because Assyria and Sennacherib were his tool. 37, verse 37. Then King Sennacherib of Israel broke camp and returned to his own land, stepping over all the corpses. He went home to his capital of Nineveh, and he stayed there. Sennacherib's a defeated man. With God's hook in the nose, which they did often to captors, and bit in his mouth, which they did for horses, and tail between his legs, he was dragged by the same road on which he had come to his own capital of Nineveh. One verse later, which is now a 20-year gap, 20 years later in 681 BC, having not learned a thing of this incredible experience that happened in the dark of night to his invincible army, he's actually still worshiping his no-god Nisroch when the escalating power struggle with his 3 sons erupts, and he is assassinated on the spot. He's run through by the swords of his 2 older sons, leaving his youngest son in charge of the shrinking Assyrian Empire. Wow. My 3 sons.
Wow.
Fred McMurray has nothing on this guy. Sennacherib was cut down just as Isaiah said he would, 37:7, laying there dead right in the temple of his own God, who he thought was stronger than Jehovah, but could not protect him. Here's Alec Motyer from his Isaiah by the Day devotional, which is great. He says, it is historically a fact, folks, a fact that following Isaiah 37, 36 to 38, Assyria entered into a period of decline until it finally was extinguished by the rising power of, you guessed it, Babylon. Go figure. Nineveh, Assyria's capital, that Jonah tried to help save through God's incredibly gracious salvation, finally fell permanently in 612 BC. There's some interesting, I would call it remote speculation from some biblical scholars. And I'm just going to bring this up to you because it is remote, and I typically don't do this, but it's just interesting to conjecture this. Some believe that Psalm 126, verse 2, which is one of what we call the Song of Ascents. You see that when you read the book of Psalms, it'll say on the front of these Psalms from 120 to 134. These Psalms are the Song of Ascents. And it's probably not more complicated than this. These are songs that were written for trudging up Mount Zion to the holy city. So if you're going to a festival or something and you're trudging up the mountain to Jerusalem, you would sing this. You know, we would sing Peace Like a River. They would sing one of these songs of ascents, right? So that's what these were. But Psalm 126, one of these, they actually think was written by King Isaiah. I just think it's interesting. So I'm going to read you Psalm 126 too. Think of Isaiah perhaps penning these words. And this is all based on Isaiah 38:20. And that's where they get their proof that this might have actually been the case. We were filled with laughter, and we sang for joy. And the other nations said, what amazing things the Lord has done for them. Yeah, you're not woofing. Right on the heels of this annihilation of 185,000 enemy troops. Amazing things that the Lord has done for them. Do you want amazing things done for you? I mean, you know, take this thing out of 701 BC and drag it kicking and screaming, which is our practical mindsets. Bring it into 2019. God has not changed at all. Do you want amazing things done for you? Then I would recommend that you spread out your requests before the Lord. And let me just risk it because we're all family and friends here. Let me just risk a little bit of Brad tweaking 1 Thessalonians 5:17. I know they're teaching 1 Thessalonians 5 next door right now, so I'm going to whisper. Pray without creasing. Pray without creasing. By that I mean this. This paper would represent the prayer. It represents me, kind of just as I am, as the hymn goes. I'm praying to God in honest transparency about everything. But we don't do that. Here's what we do. We crease here, we crease here, and we crease here. And then we pray. And then we spread it out before the Lord. God gets little of who we really are in Him. But that's how we pray. It's Einstein saying you're only using 10% of your brain. How are you functioning? How do you even order fast food like that? You get so little of who I am. And sometimes by the Holy Spirit, if He can penetrate, I'll be convicted and I'll go, you're right, I'm not praying like that. So I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to be really generous. I'm going to give up to half my kingdom to God in transparent prayer. There you go, God. What do you think? Pretty great, huh? Pretty generous. No, it's not working. Okay. Spread it all out, pour the Lord. All transparent. Here I go. Dear Lord! Okay, so what's with the corner? Well, for the sake of control, I got to keep a little for myself. Don't I? No, how about this, says God. How about humbly spreading this out completely and totally before the Lord, open-handed with no creases. Pray without creasing. You know, your prayer closet should be carpeted with these. And I know oftentimes people, with kind of a war room mentality, will tape stuff on the wall, which is admirable. Sometimes that could be viewed as a to-do list. Take them off the wall, put them on the ground, spread them out before you, and they become I don't know what to do lists. And maybe that's more important. And maybe that's where God's going to show His glory and His miraculous power and do amazing things in and through you if we pray without creasing. Why? Well, because of the postscript that we have for the end of our talk today. It's from Isaiah 37:26. But have you not heard? I decided this long ago. Long ago I planned it, and now I am making it happen. Family Ties class, spreading it out on the floor before the Lord is truly the happening place. I remember when I first took over my dad's business after all the warfare and skirmishes and desertion and everything else I felt, and I had no idea how to do this business at all. And I remember the first day I walked in owning this monster, accounting, legal aspects, I knew nothing. I was not trained one iota. It was dropped in my lap by a father who turned and ran. And I sat at my desk, I went, oh crap. And I got on my knees, and I said, God, I do not know what to do in the next half hour. And the half hour after that. And the half hour after that. And then this thing started to turn around like a giant ship because I was not the captain of it any longer. I give you that illustration to let you know that not many, to my shame, do I have those kind of dramatic elements, and I'm sure God just threw everything out from underneath me and forced me to go, okay, I get it. I'm just spreading this thing out before you because I don't know what to do. And He shows His grace, and He shows His hand, and He shows His miraculous power day after day after day after day. And I'm convinced now that whatever that is, whatever you're spreading out before the Lord, and you probably need to do this on a daily, hourly, minutely basis, that is the happening places, as we say, prayer is the work. Next week, or next time, I want you to read the airmail that is Isaiah chapter 40, where God is once again making it happen, as we saw dramatically today. And in this case, when we get back together again, it's going to be our enrollment into flight school. have a fear of flying, you come back next time. Let's close in prayer. Father, again, thank you so much for this invitation, that really this incredibly intriguing, suspenseful, historical scenario that happened in the history of Judah. This invitation to spread it out before you. There it is, in black and white, living color, as we say. That this is what we should be doing. This is what we ought to do. We should be giving it all up, not even folding a corner, because you know it anyway. It's a game unless the whole thing is spread out before you. And I pray that we would surrender, relinquish all of our sense of control, and put everything on the floor like a carpet of all the things that we have no idea what to do. Because you do. And I pray that you would work your wonders. Show yourself. Drag us, maybe even kicking and screaming, to our knees on the floor of that prayer closet or temple or wherever that may be, maybe even the kitchen floor. And show us who you are. Show us what you can do when we just give it all to you. Thank you again for the compelling way that you have articulated this fact of our spiritual lives, that when we lay it out before you, it is truly the happening place. It is where you work, and where you work best, and where you have our complete and undivided attention. May that be the case for the rest of this week and for the rest of our lives as a result of this encounter with the Word of God this morning. We give it all to you. In Jesus' name, amen. Hey, see you next time.